The pawn shop owner slid a small velvet box across the counter toward me, and inside it sat the one thing I thought I would never see again in my life, my grandmother's diamond, the exact ring that had been on my finger for 6 years until 3 weeks ago. And the man behind the counter looked me dead in the eye and said, "Ma'am, your mother-in-law tried to sell this to me for $400. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just smiled, because for the first time in 11 months, I finally had the one piece of evidence I needed to end a war that Patricia Whitfield started the very first year I married her son, and by the time I walked out of that pawn shop that afternoon, I already knew exactly how her own words were going to be the thing that destroyed her. My name is Sarah Whitfield, I'm 42 years old, and I live just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, in a quiet little neighborhood called Ballantyne, where the biggest scandal used to be somebody's dog getting loose. I never imagined that my own mother-in-law would become the biggest storm my marriage ever had to weather, but before I tell you how she tried to steal a piece of my family's history right off my hand, I want to say something, because I know a lot of you watching this have your own Patricia in your life. If you've ever sat quietly while someone tried to erase you from your own family, if you've ever smiled through gritted teeth at a Sunday dinner while somebody undermined you at the table, then you already understand the kind of patience it takes to plan a revenge that doesn't just win, but ends the war for good. So before we go any further, if stories like mine mean something to you, hit that subscribe button on Silent Revenge Stories right now, because trust me, this one is going to feel personal for a lot of you, and I promise the ending is worth every second. I married Daniel Whitfield 9 years ago in a small ceremony behind his parents' house in Matthews, North Carolina, and from the very first moment his mother Patricia laid eyes on me, I felt like I was being measured for a role I would never quite fit. Patricia was the kind of woman who ran her household like a courtroom, and everyone in that family, including her 50-year-old husband Robert, treated her opinion like it was law. She had one golden rule she repeated to anyone who would listen, that is, family things belong with family, and I would come to understand, far too late, exactly what she meant by that. The ring on my finger had belonged to my own grandmother, Eleanor, a woman who raised me after my parents passed away in a car accident when I was 19. That ring wasn't just jewelry to me. It was the last tangible piece of the woman who taught me how to stand on my own 2 feet, and Patricia knew that, because I told her the story myself at my own engagement dinner, sitting right there at her dining room table, watching her nod along like she actually cared. For years, the tension between us stayed beneath the surface, the kind of thing you learn to live with because you love your husband and you don't want to make him choose between the 2 women in his life. Patricia would make little comments about how real Whitfield women cooked their turkey a certain way, or how she couldn't believe Daniel married someone who didn't grow up in Mecklenburg County. She would show up unannounced at our house with her spare key, rearranging our kitchen cabinets while telling me it was just a suggestion. Daniel always defended me when it got bad enough, but Patricia had spent 30 years perfecting the art of making herself the victim in every argument, so most of the time I just let it go, because peace felt more important than being right. What I didn't know was that Patricia had a favorite child, Daniel's younger sister Melissa, and Melissa had just gone through an ugly divorce 18 months before all of this happened, one that left her broke, bitter, and living back in her mother's basement in Matthews at 36 years old. And somewhere in Patricia's mind, a plan started forming, a plan that involved my grandmother's ring ending up on someone else's hand. It started small, the way these things always do. Patricia began staying with us more often, claiming Robert's health scares meant she needed a break from caretaking, even though Robert was perfectly fine and simply tired of her controlling behavior at home. She would stay for a week at a time in our guest room, and during those weeks I started noticing little things missing, not big things, just small oddities, a bottle of perfume I couldn't find, an old bracelet from my jewelry box that turned up weeks later in a different drawer. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, because who wants to believe their husband's mother is quietly moving through their house like a thief? But the real moment that should have warned me came 4 months before I ever found that pawn shop receipt, on a Tuesday evening in March, when I came home from my job at a marketing firm in Uptown Charlotte and found Patricia sitting at my kitchen table with my jewelry box open in front of her, holding my grandmother's ring up to the light from the window. When she saw me, she didn't even flinch. She just smiled and said she was just admiring it, and told me it reminded her of a ring her own mother used to own. I remember feeling a chill go down my spine that I couldn't quite explain, but Daniel was in the other room, and I didn't want to start something over what felt, at the time, like nothing. 3 weeks later is when I first noticed the ring didn't feel right on my finger anymore. It's a strange thing to explain, But when you've worn the same piece of jewelry every single day for 6 years, your hand knows its weight, its balance, the way the light hits the stone at a certain angle in the morning sun through your kitchen window. One Sunday morning, washing dishes, I looked down at my hand and something felt off. The stone looked slightly duller than I remembered, and the little scratch on the inside band that I'd always meant to get buffed out at the jeweler's was gone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 6 years of dish soap and sunlight had simply changed how it looked to me, and I pushed the thought away, because at that point in my life I still believed that questioning your own family meant something was wrong with you, not with them. The truth came out because of my best friend Rachel, who happens to own a small jewelry appraisal business off South Boulevard in Charlotte. We were having lunch one Saturday when she reached across the table, grabbed my hand to admire the ring like she always did, and her face changed instantly. She got very quiet, turned my hand toward the window light, and asked me, very carefully, when I'd had the ring cleaned last. I told her I hadn't touched it in months. Rachel took a small loop out of her purse, the kind jewelers used to examine stones up close, and after about 30 seconds of silence that felt like an entire year, she looked up at me and said the words that shattered my entire world in an instant. "Sarah, this isn't your ring. This is cubic zirconia." I remember laughing at first, thinking she had to be joking, because who switches a wedding ring, and how would anyone even manage to do that without me noticing? But Rachel wasn't laughing, and the longer I sat there staring at my own hand, the more the pieces started clicking into place. Patricia in my kitchen with the ring in her hand. The missing days when I'd taken it off to shower and left it on the bathroom counter, the way I always did, right during one of Patricia's extended visits. The subtle difference in weight I'd noticed weeks earlier and dismissed as my own imagination. That night I didn't say a word to Daniel. I know a lot of you might think that's strange, but I needed proof, real proof, before I brought an accusation like that into my marriage, because Patricia had spent 9 years painting herself as the sweet, doting grandmother figure to anyone who would listen, and I knew that without hard evidence, this would turn into a he said, she said, nightmare where I would somehow end up looking like the paranoid daughter-in-law who couldn't get along with her husband's mother. So I started paying very close attention. I began quietly documenting every visit Patricia made to our house over the following weeks, noting the exact dates. I asked Rachel to write up a formal appraisal letter confirming the ring on my hand was a cubic zirconia replica, not the diamond she had appraised for us informally 3 years earlier for insurance purposes. And then I did something that would end up being the single smartest decision of this entire ordeal. I remembered that Patricia, for all her scheming, was not a technologically careful woman. She still used the same email password for everything, a password she had once given me years earlier when she asked me to help her set up her first smartphone. I want to be very clear that what I did next wasn't something I take lightly, and I'm not encouraging anyone watching this to do the same thing without thinking it through carefully, but at that point I felt like I had no other option to protect myself and my marriage from a woman who had already crossed a line I never thought a mother-in-law could cross. I logged into an old shared photo backup account that Patricia had set up years earlier on Daniel's family group cloud storage, the kind that automatically saves photos taken on a linked device, and there, buried in a folder from 3 months earlier, was a photograph Patricia had apparently taken by accident, a picture of my grandmother's actual diamond ring sitting on black velvet, clearly staged for a sale listing, with a handwritten note beside it that read a Whitfield family heirloom. Appraised, will not negotiate below asking. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set my phone down on the counter. She hadn't just switched the ring to give it to Melissa. She had been trying to sell it. Over the following 2 weeks, I traced everything methodically, the way you'd build a case, because deep down I think I already knew this needed to end in a way that Patricia could never talk her way out of. I found the name of a jewelry consignment shop near her home in Matthews where she'd inquired about selling an heirloom diamond ring. When the shop wouldn't meet her asking price, she'd apparently gone looking elsewhere, which is how she ended up at that small pawn shop off Independence Boulevard 3 weeks later, the one where the owner, a kind older man named Gary who had run that shop for over 20 years, got suspicious of a woman trying to sell what was clearly a wedding ring engraved with initials that weren't her own. Gary told her he needed to hold the item for a mandatory reporting period before any cash sale could go through, standard procedure for high-value items, and Patricia, apparently annoyed but not wanting to draw more attention to herself, left the ring there and walked out, planning to come back later once the hold period passed. That hold period is exactly what gave me the window I needed. I walked into that pawn shop myself on a Thursday afternoon, brought Rachel's appraisal letter, brought a photo of myself wearing the actual ring at my own wedding, and Gary, once he understood what had happened, handed the ring back to me without a second of hesitation, and even offered to give a statement if I ever needed one. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know some of you are wondering why I didn't confront Patricia the second I found that photo in the cloud folder. The truth is, I've learned something over the years about people like Patricia. She was the kind of woman who thrived on chaos she could control, who could turn any accusation into a performance where she was the wounded party, crying to Daniel about how his wife was attacking her, how she'd never do such a thing, how this was clearly some kind of misunderstanding. If I confronted her without absolute, undeniable proof, sitting in front of everyone with no room to spin a story, she would have wriggled out of it, and worse, she would have found a way to make me look unstable in front of the family I'd spent 9 years trying to belong to. So instead, I waited. I gathered everything. The appraisal letter. The photo from the cloud folder. A written statement from Gary at the pawn shop. Screenshots of messages Patricia had sent to Melissa that I found in that same cloud backup, messages where she wrote, "Don't tell your brother yet, but I have something special coming for you, something that's been in this family longer than that girl has." That girl. That's what she called me, in writing, to her own daughter, while planning to hand my dead grandmother's ring to someone else. Daniel's family has a tradition, a big 4th of July cookout every year at Patricia and Robert's house in Matthews, the kind where 30 or 40 relatives show up, aunts and uncles and cousins from 3 generations, all crowded onto the back patio with sweet tea and barbecue and Patricia holding court like the queen of the whole affair. This year, I decided, was going to be the year that tradition ended for her, because I already knew this was the perfect stage, the one place where Patricia couldn't control the narrative in private, the one place where she'd built her entire reputation as the beloved matriarch of the Whitfield family in front of the very people whose opinion she cared about more than anything else in the world. I told Daniel everything 3 days before the cookout. I sat him down at our kitchen table, laid out every piece of evidence in order, the appraisal letter, the photograph, Gary's statement, the messages to Melissa, and I watched my husband's face go through something I'd never seen before, a mixture of disbelief, then horror, then a kind of quiet fury I didn't know he was capable of. Daniel had always loved his mother, had always given her the benefit of the doubt even when she made things difficult for me, but there was no version of this story where he could defend her, not with proof sitting right there on our table. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him, and to his credit, he didn't hesitate for even a second. He said, "Whatever you need, I'm standing right beside you." That, more than anything else in this entire story, is the moment I knew our marriage was going to survive this, because it would have been so easy for him to ask me to let it go quietly, to protect his mother's reputation, and he didn't. The 4th of July arrived hot and bright, exactly the kind of Carolina summer day Patricia loved to show off, with her string lights across the patio and her famous peach cobbler cooling on the counter and 30-some relatives filling up her backyard with laughter and the smell of charcoal smoke. I wore the real ring that day, my grandmother's ring, cleaned and polished by Rachel herself, sitting exactly where it belonged on my hand, and I watched Patricia's eyes catch it the moment I walked through her gate. Her face went pale for just a second before she recovered with a tight little smile, and I smiled right back at her, because I already knew what was coming, and for the first time in 9 years, I wasn't the one who felt afraid at a family gathering. I waited until dinner, until everyone was seated at the long folding tables Patricia set up every year under the string lights, until Robert had said his usual toast about family and gratitude, and then I stood up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I thanked everyone for having us, the way you're supposed to, and then I said I wanted to share something important, something about a piece of jewelry that meant more to me than almost anything else I owned. I told the story of my grandmother Eleanor, the same story I told Patricia at my engagement dinner 9 years earlier, about how she raised me after my parents died, about how this ring was the last thing she ever gave me before she passed, and how 3 months ago, I discovered it had been secretly replaced with a fake. You could have heard a pin drop in that backyard. I watched Melissa's face go white as a sheet. I watched Robert turn slowly toward his wife with an expression I'd never seen on him before. And I watched Patricia try, one last time, to spin the story, opening her mouth to say something about a misunderstanding, about how she'd only been trying to have it cleaned as a surprise, and that's when I pulled out my phone and read the messages, word for word, the ones where she told her own daughter not to tell Daniel yet, the ones where she called me that girl, the ones that proved, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what she had planned to do. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply said, in front of every single person who mattered to her, that I already knew, weeks before that dinner, exactly what she had done, and that I had proof from a pawn shop, from a jeweler, from her own daughter's phone, sitting in a folder ready to be shared with anyone who doubted me. Robert stood up from that table and walked into the house without a word, and later I learned he didn't speak to Patricia for nearly 3 days after that dinner. Melissa left in tears, not for me, but because she realized the ring she'd been quietly promised had never actually belonged to her mother to give away in the first place. And Patricia, the woman who had spent 9 years making me feel like an outsider in my own family, sat frozen at the end of that table while relative after relative quietly got up, made their excuses, and left early, the way people do when they no longer want to be associated with a scandal. The aftermath was not immediate forgiveness, and I want to be honest with you about that, because real life doesn't wrap up as neatly as we sometimes wish it did. Robert insisted Patricia formally apologize to me, in writing, which she eventually did, though I don't believe for 1 second it was sincere. Daniel made the decision, entirely on his own, to limit his mother's access to our home to scheduled visits only, no more spare key, no more unannounced week-long stays. Melissa and I actually grew closer in the months that followed, once she understood she had been used as a pawn in her own mother's scheme just as much as I had been the target of it. And Patricia, for the first time in her life, learned that the family she had spent decades controlling through guilt and manipulation was capable of seeing her clearly, all at once, in front of everyone she'd spent years performing for. As for the ring, it sits exactly where it belongs, on my hand, catching the morning light through my kitchen window every single day, a reminder of my grandmother, and now, a reminder of the exact moment I stopped letting fear keep me quiet in my own family. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's that patience and proof will always beat panic and accusations, that the quietest revenge is often the most devastating one, because it leaves absolutely no room for the other person to talk their way out of it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight to protect what belongs to you from someone who was supposed to love you, I would really love for you to subscribe to Silent Revenge Stories, and please, leave a comment below and tell me what lesson you took from this, because I read every single one, and I promise you, your story matters just as much as mine does.